Welcome to this afternoon's lecture. I am John Levinson, Professor of Jewish Studies at the Divinity School. Our lecturer, Dr. Nathan MacDonald, was educated at the Universities of Cambridge and Durham, where he received his doctorate under the direction of Walter Moberly in 2002. He has been lecturer in Old Testament at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland since 2001, and has also done postdoctoral research at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, Germany. For the next 5 years, having won the Sofia Kovalevskaya Award from 2008, he will be leading a small research team examining the nature of monotheism in the exilic and post-exilic periods at the Georg August Universität in Göttingen, Germany. You got a lot of foreign stuff in your bio there. Nathan MacDonald is the author of 3 books, Not by Bread Alone, What Did the Israelites Eat? Those are 2 different books, Not by Bread Alone. It reminds me of the line of Woody Allen, I don't know if you've heard of this, that man does not live by bread alone, there must also be beverage. I don't know, did you find that was that one of the things you were arguing in this book? Not by Bread Alone, What Did the Ancient Israel, another book, What Did the Ancient Israelites Eat? And Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism. It was through an invitation to review the last of these, an elaboration of his dissertation, and the winner of the 2007 John Templeton Award for Theological Promise, that I first became aware of Dr. MacDonald and the astuteness of his thinking on whether the term monotheism is adequate to the theologies of the Hebrew Bible. I am delighted that this is the subject of his lecture this afternoon, New Directions in the Discussion of Old Testament Monotheism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nathan MacDonald.
Professor Levinson, thank you for your welcome, and also thank you to you for coming along. And it is very nice to be here in Harvard, although I'm sure you get used to people saying that, don't you? It's a bit like saying to the Queen that, it's a pleasure to meet her. I mean, it rather suggests that it might not be, or there might be a possibility that could be the case. My Cambridge education was actually in Emmanuel College. Emmanuel College has a link with this institution. A young Puritan clergyman was educated there, a man by the name of John Harvard. I'm slightly concerned, though, that the most important thing he did for this institution was his demise. And yes, I hope that you don't feel like that in about an hour's time about me. New directions in the discussion of Old Testament monotheism. Let me begin by looking at the recent debate about monotheism. Over the last 30 years, there has been a significant discussion about the origins and development of monotheism within the area of Old Testament Hebrew Bible studies. This has resulted, as I'm sure you know, in a significant shift of the scholarly consensus about the course of Israel's religious history, and added considerably to our understanding of Israel's changing notions of deity. The importance of this debate is evidenced in the number of monographs and edited volumes alone that have been devoted to this subject, never mind all the various essays and articles that have been written. The most striking feature of this paradigm shift has been the date at which monotheism appeared in Israelite religion. In the middle part of the 20th century, it was widely held that monotheism was a characteristic of the Israelites from the beginning. For William Foxwell Albright, this meant Moses was the first monotheist. For those less confident about the extent to which the beliefs of the historical Moses could be reconstructed, this meant the early Israelites who infiltrated Canaan at the end of the late Bronze Age had a strong commitment to the first commandment. From the 1980s, this intellectual paradigm has been replaced with a developing account of Israel's intellectual and religious development, which sees monotheism appear at some point around about the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. In this respect, the consensus of recent scholarship marks a return to the position held by many scholars at the end of the 19th century. There are numerous reasons for the shift in the scholarly consensus. First, a number of archaeological discoveries have raised anew the problem of Israelite and Judean religious practice and belief. The inscriptions from Kibbet el-Qum and Kuntlit Ajrud are often mentioned in this context. You'll recall that one of the inscriptions from Kuntlet Ajurt makes reference to Adonai of Samaria and his Asherah, if that is how it is to be translated. Alongside this, biblical scholars have been forced to take into account the significant amount of iconographical work from the period, due to the labours of Othmar Kiel and his colleagues at Freiburg in Switzerland. Not just written inscriptions, but these various images and pictures we have from the period. Secondly, greater attention has been given to what were seen as more marginal voices in the biblical canon. One of the positive effects of this decentering has been to destroy the monochromatic picture of earlier scholarship, revealing the diversity of religious positions held in ancient Israel. Thirdly, the confidence that biblical texts were dated to earlier periods and that the time of the judges was a significantly generative period has been increasingly undermined. As a consequence, the sharp contrast between the religion of Israel and that of her neighbours is seen to be something that is a reflection of a later period. Fourthly, a methodological ferment has resulted in newer insights being brought to bear on the biblical texts and the issue of monotheism. The most important for the discussion of monotheism have been the growing interest in feminism and the rise of social scientific approaches. The former drew attention to the importance of goddess worship before the exile and the appropriation of goddess language in post-exilic texts, such as Proverbs 1-9 maybe. The latter challenged historical reconstructions that could not provide a persuasive socio-religious context. These latter factors particularly indicate that the paradigm shift the discipline has witnessed is not just a case of chronological readjustment, as though it's merely an issue of, well, it used to be the 12th century BC and now we think it's sometime around the 6th century. Rather, the new monotheism discussion has shown itself to be considerably more sophisticated and reflective in certain aspects. This includes the attention given to a rich socio-cultural context for the rise of monotheism in the face of external and internal pressures, a greater awareness of previously neglected factors such as female religion and popular religion, so-called, a greater attention to how Israelite religion came to differentiate Adonai from other deities or how he appropriated their roles, and a greater respect for the intellectual and religious integrity of non-monotheistic beliefs, whether that is Israelite precursors to monotheism or West Semitic forms of polytheism. One feature of the last 10 years of the study of monotheism in the Old Testament area has been more careful reflection about our terminology. It has long been appreciated that terms such as monotheism, polytheism were too inflexible to describe the realities of ancient Israel. And as a result, additional terms were coined. You may be familiar with some of those: monolatry, henotheism. More recently, though, there has been a thorough questioning about the helpfulness of the terms monotheism and polytheism. Gregor Ahn has helpfully alerted scholars to the problems with polytheism. Not only does this highlight a feature of those religions to which they do not themselves draw attention to, it also subsumes under the rubric polytheism a bewildering diversity of religious beliefs. In other words, polytheism is a form of religious classification deeply indebted to a Western European perspective. It highlights the God question, or rather the question of the number of gods, as the most defining aspect of a religion. The term monotheism has been subject to similar criticisms. A number of theologians working in the history of ideas have observed how monotheism reflects its modern origin. The Cambridge theologian Nicholas Lash has shown that terms such as monotheism, polytheism, atheism were part of the early Enlightenment's attempts to organize religious knowledge along the species and genus model of the sciences. The rich complexity of religious belief and practice were reduced to one aspect of theology: the number of gods believed in. In addition, the Chicago theologian David Tracy observes that monotheism is an Enlightenment invention. that bears all the marks of Enlightenment rationalism. Monotheism, in this not so secretly evolutionary view, is a contrast word to polytheism. That is, by Enlightenment standards, monotheism is a more rational understanding of the logic of the divine, as implying a unicity of divine power, not a dispersal of power into many gods and goddesses. Like the other famous isms of the Enlightenment, deism, pantheism, theism, panentheism, modern philosophical monotheism is, above all, rational and ethical. In both cases, those words have scare quotes around them in David Tracy's original. Such observations from those well-versed in the history of ideas have significant hermeneutical implications, I think, for the research undertaken by Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholars. It was within that context that I published my book that has already been mentioned, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism. The book argued that more careful thought had to be given to the conceptuality that was commonly introduced to explore Israelite monotheism. Through a detailed analysis of select scholars from Abraham Kuhnen to Robert Neuser, I sought to show that certain features of monotheism were assumed rather than conclusively derived from the biblical text. These assumptions, monotheism as universalistic, ethical, anti-magical, an intellectual form of belief, reflect interpreters' late modern context, much more so than the religious context of mid-first millennium BC Levant. One feature of the recent discussion of monotheism that particularly worried me at that time was the tendency to view monotheism as a stage of religion from which regression was inconceivable. This idea can already be found in the German theologian Schleiermacher. Therefore, it can now justly be said that anywhere where piety has developed to a belief in one God over all, it can be seen, it can be that people in no part of the earth can remain at a lower level of belief. As far as history reaches, nowhere can a retreat from monotheism be observed. If only Schleiermacher had lived another 2 centuries. Of course, very few Old Testament scholars would hold to an evolutionary progression of the sort to which Schleiermacher subscribed. And yet, the idea that monotheism marks an uncrossable line still seems to haunt the field. In my view, the ubiquitous language within Old Testament scholarship of the breakthrough to monotheism and the quest for the exact moment when some Israelite finally perceives the truth of monotheism, finally gets it, is evidence of this thinking. But I think there are also other indicators, and these also worry me. First, for most interpreters, monotheism is monochromatic, or I suppose, as Nietzsche would put it, monotheism. The focus of intellectual interest in the last 30 years has been almost entirely on the pre-exilic period, when we have this transition from some form of polytheism, maybe through monolatry, and towards monotheism. All these things are still under negotiation. The discussions about Israel's religious development depend, for their intellectual effectiveness, on the existence of variegated religious expressions in Israel. That is, the period from the 9th to the 6th century BC is characterized by considerable religious diversity, such that it is possible to discuss when Adonai was given precedence in the divine council, if he had a consort, how various divine attributes are over time assumed by Adonai, and when the transition from monolatry to an exclusive monotheism finally took place. In contrast, our vocabulary for describing the religious ideas after the putative flowering of monotheism with Deutero-Isaiah is, it seems to me, decidedly impoverished. My point here is just this, that to label a theology as monotheistic is really only to begin describing it. At this point, I must even venture a disagreement with the admirable work of Mark Smith of New York University. Smith concludes his fairly recent book, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, with observations about how moderns and ancients read the Bible for a singular monotheism. He observes, the dominant voices preserved in the post-exilic period, priestly, Deuteronomic, wisdom, and apocalyptic, all promoted the new vision of the one and only deity, the one to whom the religions of the book have continued to turn for inspiration. Like the ancient transmitters of biblical traditions, later readers confront the complex and many biblical texts and their shaping as a single text, now called the Bible, an experience that induces a single reading of a single deity whose divinity spans all of its individual texts and beyond. Now, there is subtlety here, I do grant. But for Smith, there are, yes, different voices, but they are united into a singular vision. So Smith can map out the diversity of pre-exilic traditions. These are Smith's complex and many biblical texts. But the post-exilic recipients are characterized by a unity of belief, Smith's new vision, his single reading. What Smith is struggling with here is the acknowledged fact of the diversity of beliefs and practices in the post-exilic period and a fixed, determinate notion of monotheism. My question would be what descriptive power this label monotheism actually has, and as importantly, what does it obscure in the process? Smith, it seems to me, is in danger of confusing prescription and description. Some of the Bible's monotheistic theologies do closely prescribe religious belief and practice, Deuteronomy being the most apt example. Yet the ambitions of some monotheistic ideologies and their realization need to be carefully distinguished. Thus, in my view, we might be better to speak of a number of monotheistic visions with overlapping concerns and interests, sometimes in tension with one another, sometimes speaking with a common voice. Smith's priestly, Deuteronomic, wisdom, and apocalyptic is to name four of the most significant monotheistic visions in the Old Testament. The diversity of Judaism in the first centuries BC and AD is evidence that no single vision achieved dominance. The second consequence is closely related. With few exceptions, such as the question of what lies behind the language of wisdom in Proverbs 1-9, or the discussion of deities in the Jewish papyri from Elephantine, there is relatively little interest in the different forms that monotheistic belief and practice took in the post-exilic period. Consequently, discussions of monotheism in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible almost invariably conclude with the moment of monotheism's breakthrough. This is the case even where there is disagreement as to whom should be credited with this achievement. Again, Mark Smith's book is typical of this. Having taken us through the diversity of pre-exilic belief, the various questions that one must address, we finally reach the breakthrough of monotheism with 2nd Isaiah, and it is time to seal up the book. Professor Smith can write a flourishing the end, and his job is done. And for Christian theologians, you can just pass it on to your New Testament scholars, who then pick up the question of the Trinity. And Smith is not unusual in this respect. Monotheism ends with 2nd Isaiah. The Old Testament scholar's job is done. What more is there to be said? There is then, in my view, a considerable lacuna that demands, but has not really received, academic exploration. Now, I'm not alone in thinking this. Already, this lacuna is identified by Fritz Stoltz in his Introduction to Biblical Monotheism. In that book, Stoltz devotes about 100 pages to the breakthrough up to the point of the breakthrough of monotheism with Deutero-Isaiah. But Stoltz also includes 16 pages given to the reworking of the concept of the divine in the post-exilic period. He rightly observes in introducing that discussion that while the themes with which we have been concerned are the classic objects of a discussion of monotheism, this cannot be said of the next section. Of course, for the post-exilic period, the unicity and uniqueness of God is widely assumed, at least in the circles which have made history. Similarly, I could point to Klaus Koch, who recently wrote on the book of Isaiah that the Deutero-Isaianic chapters do not mark the end of Israel's road to monotheism. There was an extended sequel in the following centuries. Isaiah 56 to 66, nowadays often called Trito-Isaiah, is to a great extent a commentary and reinterpretation of chapters 40 to 55, originating in post-exilic times. At the turn of the era, the communities of the New Covenant at Qumran and in the New Testament had recourse to these chapters for the legitimation of their self-understanding. The point that Stoltz and Koch are making is this. Not that non-monotheistic versions of Yahwism continued into the Second Temple period, which presumably they did, as we can see from the text from Elephantine or from Susan Ackerman's work on Isaiah 56 to 66. But what they're seeking to point out is that the nature of Israel's monotheistic beliefs continue to be under negotiation. They continue to exhibit themselves in diverse forms. So what I want to offer now are some preliminary probes into what we might call early Jewish monotheisms. Because as far as I can see, the hints provided by Stoltz and Koch have not yet been followed. Now what I want to do is mainly in the remaining part of my lecture to examine monotheism in the book of Isaiah. You'll notice that's deliberate, not just Isaiah 40 to 55, but the book of Isaiah as a whole. But before we do so, I want to just have a brief side glance at the so-called priestly tradition in the Pentateuch, just to underline some of the arguments that I've been making. For it's generally acknowledged, is it not, that the priestly writer believes in one God. The creation story in Genesis 1 is often taken as a programmatic statement of priestly theology, which begins unequivocally with the words, "In the beginning, God." But despite this, the priestly writer's monotheism has not been the subject of sustained attention. A surprising fact, one would have thought, when doctoral students are always desperately seeking doctoral theses. There have been one or two essays in recent years which have recognized this and have begun to make preliminary attempts to characterize the monotheism of the priestly writing. There has also been the observations, problematic observations, I think, but the observations by Mary Douglas and Jacob Milgram that the priestly writer's monotheism is exemplified in anti-magical ritual. To my mind, what is interesting about the priestly writer is not only providing an account of his monotheism, but also accounting for the reasons for this neglect. And I suspect they're not too difficult to discern. The priestly writer does not easily accord with the uncritical assumption sometimes made that monotheism is most characteristically ethical, where ethical is very often a code word for not ritualistic. Now, even as recently as 1997, Robert Neuser gives expression to this when he explores the consequences of Israelite monotheism in the following way. This is Neuser. A great abyss opens between God and people, nature or the world below. Revelation cannot be found in nature, but only in the spoken word in the arena of history. Word thus replaces image, and the imperative is now more clear, and it directs people more to social behavior than to cultic activity. This is a statement that is problematic, it seems to me, on numerous levels. But its perspective is particularly difficult to square, one would have thought, with most accounts of the priestly writer. Indeed, the priestly writer offers a monotheistic vision that is interesting in many ways because of its differences from that secured in other traditions, such as the Deuteronomic tradition. But anyway, that was just a sort of side glance, just to underline some of the things I've been saying about the way that monotheism is conceptualized and the way that drives our reading of the Old Testament. But let us now turn to the book of Isaiah. Most recent work on monotheism and Isaiah, at least in the Anglo-American world, has assumed a relatively uncomplicated critical account of Isaiah and monotheism. Second Isaiah, understood as Isaiah 40 to 55, is recognized as an early, if not the earliest, proponent of a full monotheism. In my own view, this is particularly the case because for many scholars, all the lights have finally lit up, and that's why Deutero-Isaiah can be given this crown. You look at Isaiah 40 to 55 and you say, well, he doesn't like idols, and he's ethical in the way that we think he ought to be. There's nothing about ritual in there, and he's universalistic, and all the lights have lit up, so therefore we really truly have monotheism here. And I fear that, although that might seem like a caricature, sometimes it is genuinely representative of what goes on in some scholars' work. This is the case that Deutero-Isaiah is the earliest proponent, or an early proponent of a full monotheism, is demonstrated not only by the unambiguous monotheistic formula, but by these various ideas that are consequent upon monotheism. Now, you can find such an account, or you will be able to find such an account of Second Isaiah's monotheism in a soon-to-be-published essay by Howell Clifford. This is a paper that was presented at the Oxford Old Testament Seminar, and it's to be published in a collection due to come out sometime this year, edited by John Day, entitled Prophets and Prophecy. Clifford's essay offers a defense of what he, with some justification, sees as the consensus view on Second Isaiah and its monotheism. In Second Isaiah, we have the clearest evidence of the emergence of an absolute monotheism towards the end of the exile. Idle satire plays a central role, for this sees other gods satirized as nothing more than human creations. Adonai, by contrast, is the creator of all. This creative power is seen not only in the founding of the cosmos, but also in the formation of human history. Adonai's unique power in this sphere is seen through predictive prophecy. With this power in history, Adonai brings weal and woe. According to Clifford, Adonai's creative power, his sovereignty over history, and his ability to prophesy provide what he calls the bases for monotheism. These beliefs give rise to a monotheistic rhetoric that exhibits itself in exclusionary formulae, as well as in the traditional incomparability formulae that we find at earlier points in Israel's history. Let me unpack that a little bit. The exclusionary formulae are those such as, I am God and there is no other. The existence of other deities is excluded. And the more traditional incomparability formula is something like, there is none like me. So there may be other deities, but none of them is quite as good or as powerful or as able as Adonai himself. Second Isaiah's monotheism results for Clifford in a number of consequences. First, what is usually described as universalism, though Clifford avoids this term. He is right to do so. I'm not sure whether he has actually read Professor Levinson's essay on this subject, but it's not a term whose meaning is transparent. It can be used in a variety of ways, but it's fairly clear what Clifford thinks 2nd Isaiah believes. He holds to what might be called a strong universalism. This is what Clifford says: one religion for one world under one God. Secondly, Clifford discerns in 2nd Isaiah a systematizing potential, by which he means 2nd Isaiah's theology has unity and consistency. Such an account, I think, deserves to be problematized. First, any modern treatment of 2nd Isaiah's monotheism is surely going to have to take into consideration the compositional complexity of Isaiah 40 to 55 and its place within the book of Isaiah. On the one hand, there are questions as whether, in fact, Isaiah 40 to 55 is a unified piece of work, and that's particularly been explored within German scholarship. But there is also the question of how these chapters relate to the rest of the book of Isaiah. Now, we may follow Hugh Williamson and argue that 2nd Isaiah was composed as a continuation of a revised 1st Isaiah. That is, that 2nd Isaiah himself was the editor of 1st Isaiah. Alternatively, we may follow Steck and his pupils in holding that 2nd Isaiah was only secondarily redacted into 1st Isaiah. That is, that 2nd Isaiah had its own existence for a number of years before it was finally joined together with 1st Isaiah. Either way, we cannot simply work, as many still do, with the monotheism of Isaiah 40 to 55, or more accurately, Isaiah 40 to 48, because this is where we find the primary statements about monotheism. Because if we do so, we're just piling up reification upon reification. We have to take seriously the fact that Isaiah 40 to 55 does not remain on its own. It finds itself at some point as part of a larger unity, the unity of the book of Isaiah. Second, I think we must give more attention to the rhetorical and occasional nature of 2nd Isaiah's work. Too often, 2nd Isaiah is treated as an exercise in systematic theology, albeit with a little nod towards his late exilic content. Mark Smith, at this point, I think, points us in the right direction by describing 2nd Isaiah as a new stage in religious rhetoric, more than a new stage in religion. But the occasional nature is important too. For what the anonymous prophet gives us falls far short of a comprehensive picture of Adonai, Israel, or Adonai's expectations upon Israel. Temple and sacrifice, for example, are barely mentioned. The prophet offers comfort and encouragement to an exiled people, promising imminent salvation. Elevating it may be. But it is a message that is narrowly conceived and within its historical context, understandably so. Yet even here, we should not ignore the hints to realities presupposed for the monotheism of 2nd Isaiah. Though sometimes overlooked by those who argue for 2nd Isaiah's universalism, this is a message that will lead to Judah. More specifically, to Jerusalem. In addition, there is a Torah associated with Adonai and his chosen servant. 2nd Isaiah's monotheism may be less bare than it often appears, at least in many scholarly presentations. Cultic realities may be presupposed rather than explicitly articulated. So let's have a brief look at 2nd Isaiah's monotheism. A natural place to begin in examining monotheism in the book of Isaiah is indeed 2nd Isaiah's affirmations about Adonai. Certainly the prophet offers strong claims for the uniqueness of Adonai, for which there already seems to have existed a vivid tradition. He deploys the incomparability formulae to demonstrate that Adonai is not simply a god amongst the gods. the formulae of self-predication, I am he and I am Adonai, seem consciously to echo the Exodus story with its idea of Adonai's triumph over foreign powers and deities. Adonai also lays claim to the divine title El. Second Isaiah's distinctive use, which is of course obscured in English translations, suggests that Adonai has exclusive claim to a title that evokes supremacy in a West Semitic context. This claim to uniqueness is demonstrated forcefully in the fulfillment of predicative prophecy. Does Second Isaiah go beyond this traditional affirmation of uniqueness in his statement that there is no other, for example, Isaiah 45, 5-6? Many scholars believe that under the unique pressure of accounting for Adonai's actions in the Babylonian exile, the anonymous prophet moves beyond an affirmation of uniqueness to a denial of the ontological existence of other deities. We have then, with Second Isaiah, Israel making the breakthrough to monotheism. But the matter is somewhat more complicated than standard accounts suggest. Not least, one would have thought this is important, not least because it's actually very difficult to jump behind the rhetoric as though one can somehow emerge into the mind of the prophet. But there are other things that we should observe. First, we should observe that the statement "there is no other" is usually appended to formulae of self-predication. I am Adonai, or I am El. As I've already indicated, these seem to be claiming that Adonai is unique. They have a parallel in Deuteronomy, where the statement "there is no other" is prefixed with Adonai is God, Deuteronomy 4, 35 and 39. In the book of Deuteronomy, many gods are mentioned, but only Adonai is the God, to provide a very literal translation. Thus, the statement "there is no other" may do no more than affirm the uniqueness of Adonai negatively. There is no other deity that belongs to this category. There is no other deity that can claim to be El. Secondly, the rhetorical nature of Second Isaiah's message needs to be observed. The difficulties are especially apparent when we observe that Queen Babylon makes a similar claim to Adonai, slightly different but still similar, in Isaiah 47. I am and there is no other. Third, it has often been observed that in the middle part of the first millennium, Assyrian and Babylonian worshippers were apt to describe their deities in exclusive terms. This rhetorical effectiveness is described by Hartman as henolatry. The worshipper describes the deity being petitioned as without rival. Yet this exists within the context of a flourishing polytheism. Indeed, in a recent study, Matthias Albani argues that such inclusive monotheism of the Babylonians, where other deities are seen as expressions of Marduk, was the principal stimulus for Second Isaiah. Albani's arguments strike me as unconvincing, but his work is a reminder that claims about a deity's exclusiveness should not be pressed too quickly into ontological statements. It's not surprising, then, that there has always existed a minority of scholars who have dissented from the idea that Second Isaiah proclaims monotheism. Already in 1956, James Barr proclaimed himself skeptical about some of the claims being made about Second Isaiah's monotheism. In a similar vein, John Collins has more recently suggested that Second Isaiah is about power, not ontology, whilst Christopher Seitz speaks about a henotheism of a particularly potent stripe. Such views recognize that these monotheistic statements, let us call them, aim principally to express Adonai's power to act for his people. In particular, it is noteworthy that a number of these monotheistic statements climax with a soteriological claim. Beside me there is no Saviour, 43:11. There is no one who can deliver from my hand, 43:13. The idols of the nations and Queen Babylon, in contrast, are unable to save themselves or others. So these monotheistic statements must not be isolated from the overall thrust of Second Isaiah's message that Adonai has now come to act decisively for Israel. Nor are we able, at some level, to isolate these monotheistic statements from the rest of the book of Isaiah. It is striking that these statements are restricted to chapters 40 to 48, not even chapters 40 to 55. They only occur in a small portion of what is usually called 2nd Isaiah. Now, it seems to me that these are brought into some relationship with Isaianic language that Adonai is exalted. Two observations sustain this equation. First, in the present form of the book, Hezekiah's prayer and Isaiah's oracle in Isaiah 37 act as a sort of lexicon between the first and second parts of the book. Hezekiah utters his prayer, and in that prayer he makes monotheistic affirmations. Hezekiah confesses that Adonai alone is God, Ha Elohim, and that he is Adonai alone. The oracle that Isaiah delivers in response has the typical themes that we find in common with 1st Isaiah, most especially the theme of Adonai's exaltation at the expense of all others, including Sennacherib. So here I think we have a form of dictionary, where Hezekiah's prayer uses slightly different language, but nevertheless makes reference, I think, to the monotheistic rhetoric of Isaiah 40 to 55. And it is equated by Isaiah with this language that we find elsewhere of loftiness, God being exalted. Secondly, the loftiness of Israel's God is an important aspect of 1st Isaiah's presentation of Adonai. In the account of his call, of course, Isaiah describes Adonai sitting on a throne that is high and lifted up, 6 verse 1. As Williamson observes, the description of God in Isaiah 6:1 has exerted an influence on the whole of the Isaianic tradition. Well, yes, but Isaiah 40 to 55 never speaks, as far as I'm aware, of Adonai being lifted up and exalted in the way that 1st Isaiah or even 3rd Isaiah do. Nevertheless, these chapters are suffused with the theme of Adonai's exaltation, albeit expressed in different terms, those of a monotheistic rhetoric. So when we talk about the monotheistic statements of Isaiah 40 to 48, we're also going to have to bring them into this larger context. In his forthcoming essay, Clifford recognizes something of the rhetorical nature of 2nd Isaiah's statements. He concedes as much when he shifts the argument about monotheism from 2nd Isaiah's exclusionary formulae to the idol polemic. He realizes that there's shifting ground when we look at these exclusionary polemic. It's hard to know exactly whether they are more rhetorical. He shifts instead to idol polemic. According to Clifford, 2nd Isaiah's idol satire is of central significance to his monotheism. All gods are equated with idols, which are nothing but human creations. The prophet witnesses to a rigorous process of de-deification of idols, de-deification of the world. Now, as Clifford himself recognizes, a prior question is always going to be whether, in fact, the idol polemic is part of the original 2nd Isaiah, or the result of a later redaction, as someone like Reinhard Kratz would suggest. But even granting this, I wonder whether the common understanding of the idol polemic properly appreciates what the prophet seeks to achieve in those polemics. In this respect, I find very suggestive the work by Knut Holter on the idol fabrication passages in 2nd Isaiah. Holter argues that the primary contrast that the prophet wishes to draw is not, as is often understood, between Adonai and the idols, but between Adonai and the idol fabricators. Now, Holter sustains his observations through a detailed examination of the idol fabrication passages in their context in 2nd Isaiah. Holter shows that the language used of making an idol is the same language that is employed elsewhere of Israel. The word is chosen, Bachar. Israel is chosen. The word is made or formed. Israel is made or formed. Holter's arguments provide one reason why the focus of the polemic is on the fabrication of idols rather than their worship in the temple. It's not just that the prophet is familiar with the mouth-opening rituals of the Babylonians, but he has a particular purpose in contrasting the creative activity of Adonai and the futile acting of the idol makers. Now, it seems to me that Halter's ideas can be developed further. It's already suggested by some of the observations he's made. Not only is there is the contrast being drawn between Adonai and the idol fabricators, but also between Israel and the idols. Like the idols, Israel is deaf and blind. Adonai takes dead Israel, who like a piece of wood in the forest cannot see or hear, and he forms new life. He forms new life so that Israel can be his witness. Exactly the thing that is said not to be the case of the idols. The idols are not able to be witnesses because they are dumb and blind. But Israel was dumb and blind and has now been given new life so that she can see and hear and testify to Adonai's deeds. Of course, that comparison is nowhere clearer, is it, than in the very famous Isaiah 46. In a vivid image, the prophet contrasts the Babylonians carrying their idols into captivity with Adonai, who carries his people. So the prophecies in Isaiah 40 to 48 contain a contrast primarily between Adonai and the Babylonian fabricators. The polemic is aimed against the idol makers, primarily, not the Babylonian pantheon. And this is consistent because it is the nations in 2nd Isaiah who are called to trial by Adonai in these chapters, not their gods. Now, that's not to say that we should exclude the existence of a comparison between Adonai and the Babylonian gods. But what I want to suggest to you is that 2nd Isaiah is primarily concerned to create a comparison between the Babylonian gods and Israel, the servant of Adonai. Both are blind, deaf, and powerless. But now Israel has been created, chosen, formed by God in order to be his witness. The difficulties of interpreting 2nd Isaiah and its rhetoric are particularly apparent when we come to the thorny question of universalism. Proof enough is offered by the numerous studies which seek to argue that Deutero-Isaiah has a strong universalism, or that he has not yet discarded a traditional particularism. You'll know that there are various viewpoints on this debate, trying to make sense of what the prophet is saying. Now, in my view, the language of universalism and particularism, in the way that it polarizes this issue, is unfortunate. It encourages a two-dimensional approach to the problem. In fact, as we've already seen, justice needs to be done to the centrality of Israel in Adonai's plans and the place of Jerusalem. The recent article by Kaminsky and Stewart in the Harvard Theological Review seek to capture this when they observe that the prophet evokes a type of universalism, but one that maintains and even deepens Israel's particularistic election. It is Israel that will be the light to the nations. 42:6, 49:6. It is Israel who will bring the justice of Adonai's Torah. 42:4, 51:4. This vision of 2nd Isaiah accords well with Isaiah 2, verses 1 to 4, where the nations stream to Jerusalem in order to learn Torah. Again, you see, we have to move over the traditional boundaries of 2nd Isaiah if we're going to do justice to everything that's going on in this book. At the center of Adonai's instituted order, his order for the whole world, is his servant Israel. It is to her that splendor and salvation comes, 46:13. As a result, the nations will come to Israel in humility and subservience, most infamously, of course, 49:23. There is to be a universal recognition of the glory of Israel's God, rather than all nations partaking on equal terms in the worship of Adonai. The importance of Jerusalem and the land in 2nd Isaiah is too often overlooked. This is especially the case when Isaiah 40 to 55 is seen as part of a monotheistic redefinition of Israelite identity stemming from the trauma of the exile. It has been suggested, for example, that the loss of monarchy and land as defining marks of Judean identity leads to a new emphasis on Israel's God and the text he gives Israel. Indeed, this is how Mark Smith puts it. We might say that text substitutes for land. Yet this portrayal seems to me difficult to square with the centrality of return to the land in 2nd Isaiah's message, and with what we know about Second Temple Judaism. Now, that's not to say that land and the temple are not significantly reconfigured in the post-exilic period, but they're certainly not erased and replaced by a text. Indeed, the exile could be seen as making these realities even more important than they formerly were. Many of the most important texts about land in the Old Testament originate from times when its loss had to be contemplated. Some of the complications about Deutero-Isaiah's understanding of Israel and the nations result from the later development of the material, of course, and again we find ourselves having to push across the boundaries of Isaiah 40 to 55. There's an elusiveness to 2nd Isaiah's rhetoric that will allow Isaiah 40 to 55 to be appropriated in novel ways. Most especially, and I guess what we're most familiar with, or at least I'm most familiar with, of course, is the way that this is appropriated in the New Testament. But this is already taking place in what is usually called Trito-Isaiah. As Kaminsky and Stewart rightly observe, there is, quote, a greater receptivity to the inclusion of some Gentiles within the elect group, as appears within the late text of 3rd Isaiah in chapters 56 and 66. Some other late texts, such as the vision of Egypt and Assyria uniting with Israel in Isaiah 19, or the gathering of the nations at the eschatological meal in Isaiah 24, suggest a vision that is broader or differently conceived than we find in Deutero-Isaiah. So again, we find the material is still being developed within the book. And we need to observe the way that this happens, not only within Isaiah 40 to 55, but within the whole of the redaction and development of the book of Isaiah. So my conclusion. Brevard Childs once described the concept of monotheism as theologically inert. It is somewhat ironic that a conceptuality that has proved so generative in our pursuit of a better understanding of the pre-exilic period should prove so inert from the point it makes its putative historical appearance. This would seem to suggest that monotheism was more interesting in its teleological anticipation than in its appearance. Maybe that's always the case with expectation and hope. For the post-exilic period, a diverse set of beliefs and practices are collected under this simple rubric, monotheism. The term simply lacks any utility except as a broad qualifier of Jewish belief. In my first book, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, I suppose I rather thought that I was, or what I hoped I was doing was giving the conceptuality the last rites, as far as biblical studies is concerned. Even at the time I realized that was rather futile, even if you don't like the word yourself. It's hard to be the policeman within scholarship and tell people they can no longer use a word that everybody's used to using. Yet with monotheism still having powerful purchase in our culture's angst over modernity, religion, exclusivism and violence, I wonder whether I was doing the wrong thing. Maybe I should have not been performing the last rites. Maybe I should have been doing some cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Not to resurrect what Charles describes as the theologically inert, but to start putting flesh on the bones of early Jewish monotheisms, to show what it could mean for different writers, to show how diverse sets of beliefs could also meet with one another, at what points they met and at what points they diverged, and how they could all be brought together into a canonical book that is recognized and looked to by Jews and Christians. Thank you.
Will you entertain some questions?
Of course.
Will you also answer them? Yeah. Okay.
That's a different one.
Good. So why don't you field your own questions?
I'll answer the ones that I can. Yes, please.
Thanks, sir. I want to push you a little further in the direction I thought you were going in trying to get away from abstraction and what systematic theologians or philosophers like to do, you mentioned Schleiermacher, and see if you could add to the historical thickness of your analysis by paying a little more attention to the setting of 40 to 55. First of all, just a yes or no. Do you see it in the exile, or do you go with the minority view that sees this as written in the land of Israel? Maybe you're seeing this as originating, if you take 46 seriously, as originating within the eyeshot of the Keep Festival, right? Mm-hmm. So if you do that, then you can draw on a lot of knowledge of the immediate area in which they are experiencing sin. And it seems to me that this adds a dimension. I like to contrast it with what Jimmy Roberts described as the tendency towards monotheism already, if you look at the Enuma Elish, and that the names all being ascribed to Marduk. And he sees that as related to the waxing and waning of hegemonic power in a time when you have a mighty Hammurabi or whoever this later epigon is that can appropriate this myth in ritual text. You can make that kind of a claim. Now, switching that to the historical setting, if it is the exile of 40 to 55, you have the opposite. It's not the claim that can be the boast of the victorious people, but it's the losers that now are confronting sort of the death blow to the little claim that they had made, that they've got this modest little God who lives in Jerusalem. And that seems to be blown by 587. So it seems to me if you can reflect on that threat, observing now how they make an idol, on the basis of his knowledge, obviously, of the actual ritual, the old thing you alluded to, and how they mock, how he or she or whoever it is mocks the God that has to be carried on a bird, on a beast, whereas God carries Israel. You begin to see that this is not abstract at all. And then I think your rhetoric can really come in here too. This is a life and death struggle of a people who's about to lose whatever claim they had for a very modest little deity in their cult site. Would that be a direction that would be friendly to your analysis?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I certainly don't. I certainly am not opposed to any form of historical and social thickness that we need to add to our account. I mean, I hope in what I was saying, and I think you picked it up on one or two occasions, just in the comments that you made, that there are points at which I'm, referring to the particular historical context. I'm certainly by no means dehistoricizing it, even if most of my lecture was operating at a sort of a level above rooting everything in some sort of historical reality or some historical occasion. But yes, I mean, in answer to your first question, I'm familiar with some of the arguments that are made about a Palestinian provenance, though I think that the case for a Babylonian provenance is probably stronger still. It seems to me to be more persuasive. And yes, that Isaiah, second Isaiah, is familiar both with some of the theology and some of the ideas surrounding the construction of idols and the rituals that went along with that, and possibly also in Enuma Elish and some of the ideas, some of the things that were going on in Babylon at the end of the what we call the exilic period. I'm certainly this whole question about whether in fact there is some form of inclusive monotheism that Second Isaiah is drawing upon or responding to. I find that less convincing. This has been explored in length by Matthias Albani in I think it's 2001 work, in which he goes into a great deal of detail about what aspects of astralization are being reflected in Second Isaiah, and he thinks that Second Isaiah is very aware of the kind of internal conflict that is taking place within Babylonian theology at that time. I find it interesting, and I think it's useful at some points, but it would seem to me that an awful lot of where Second Isaiah is going with his theology is can be seen as sort of belonging to internal developments within Israelite theology, rather than something that's being directed or being encouraged, forced upon it from outside by developments from Babylonian theology.
I like that. I want to add one little thought, that if you wanted to take an example of a more theological move, you could go from Deuteronomy 32:7 to 9 to Psalm 82. It seems to me there you have more of the propositional attack on polytheism.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree completely with you that what I see in Second Isaiah is much more in process than it is in abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
But thanks. I think
yeah, and then yeah.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. One about Deuteronomy, one about Second Isaiah. About Deuteronomy, and guys, this enlightenment numbers question that you brought up, how many gods do we have? And if these questions are answered in your book, you'll forgive me for that. I can look there too. But isn't it true also that Deuteronomy 4 and 32, which Professor Anderson just mentioned, are also obsessed with the numbers question themselves? Like when, for instance, in Deuteronomy 4, there's this kind of ideology for why other nations have, astral deities. One that was, I think, in a Septuagint manuscript, if I'm not mistaken, was, there was an attempt to monkey with that, toy with that. So there's an awareness right there that that's an issue. And also, of course, in Deuteronomy 32, whoever changed B'nai Israel, or the other way around, was playing the numbers game too, right? So one question is, well, I guess it's more of a statement, is that that's also a concern in Deuteronomy, not just an enlightenment concern. And then I wonder also, I'll just say the second question and shut up. In Second Isaiah, you use this term monotheistic rhetoric, which Smith also uses that a lot. And that term I think is interesting because it makes me just wonder, what is rhetoric then? Or, as if it's, we use this term, oh, that's just rhetoric, as though, somewhere down the line people mistook rhetoric for ontology, and now there's a single God when really we were just doing something else. And so I'm just curious if you could clarify a little bit what you meant by that term rhetoric.
Yeah, I think your second question is very perceptive, and it's an area in which I'm beginning to realize the limitations of my own thinking and reading at this point, which is that even what is written here, partly I've reached a point with this that what I'd written, and I realized I couldn't actually go back and do the work that I now appreciate that I'm needing to do. But I think here, and also I think in my early work, I need to think a lot more carefully about the nature of rhetoric and what I mean when I'm using that, and certainly not to be contrasting as sharply as I hear myself sometimes doing rhetoric and ontology. And I think you're right to pick that up. And yeah, fair enough. I agree with you. Yeah, I think that's a perceptive observation. The first question. I think I want to allow that there is, and this again would be a nuancing of what I'd written first in my book. The nice thing about making your PhD into a book is that you have a long time for the rest of your career to repent of the things that you think that you overstated. And it was a book that was overstated, and deliberately so. But I think I would, I'm convinced by Mark Smith in this respect that there is an intellectual aspect to the development of thought. Thought is being developed, and they're conscious of this. So I would want to allow that, whilst also saying yes, but we mustn't lose. What we mustn't lose is the wider, thicker context of what this belief and commitment to the one God means. And so in Second Isaiah, what I've been trying to do here is to show that it involves certain things that are often misplaced or not heard. The centrality of Jerusalem, the centrality of Torah, the election of Israel, a specific people. And the same sort of concerns are present also in Deuteronomy. With the election of Israel, with the fact that this is a wholehearted commitment that is to be shown in the rejection of any ideas that Adonai can somehow be present in either the celestial objects or objects on earth. The idea that that commitment to Adonai needs to be exemplified in certain kinds of practices that you find, for example, in Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 to 9. So I would perhaps now a little bit more carefully want to allow for an intellectual side to what is going on in a book like Deuteronomy, but I think it's crucial not to lose this wider aspect. What's going on in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8? I've occasionally allowed myself to speculate, and it's actually there in my book, although nobody's ever picked up on it, I think. I wonder whether this variant in the Septuagint, I'm not necessarily convinced that it's an anti-polytheistic change. I think within the context of Deuteronomy 32, where some language appears again and again, language that the son of, not language of B'nai Elohim, but the language of sonship, and this particularly is the sonship of Adonai in Deuteronomy 32, occurs on so many occasions, and it's always of Israel. I wonder whether it's simply that somebody's glossed it to say, what does it mean when we talk about the Son of God? Somebody's glossed, this means Israel, because this is what it means elsewhere in Deuteronomy 32, and actually this gloss has ended up in the text. That's actually a possible account of that textual variant, and yeah, I kind of want to float it out there as a possibility rather than the assumption that this is an anti-polytheistic change.
Seems to be at least a feeling of awkwardness if you're speaking of offspring. I mean, there you go. And you got Angeloi rather than you expect Malachim. B'nai Elohim just simply jars, and so both the Targumim and Septuagint just try to tone things down. Is that what's happening to
well, I mean that's how to deal with a. That's how to deal with the text, which does say B'nai Elohim. I mean, what happens is that it becomes B'nai Yisrael in 32. Sorry, the question was here.
I actually kind of love to be probably the same thing in a different direction, but I would be interested in hearing the kinds of questions you would ask with these texts if you weren't circling around this concept of monotheism. That, I thought it is very provocative to say, what is actually important within the world of these texts, or even besides the counting of God. And I hear you describing your project towards the end of your talk being, sort of talking about monotheism in the plural. But I think what's at stake in this word thickness that people keep throwing around with its reference here is that perhaps some of the categories of religion should have something to do with religious practice, with the dynamics between human beings, the dynamics between the concept of human and divine. And I hear that sometimes with Jim Roberts, that gets into a question about rulership, and you get some of that. But the way you said the intellectual history in your talk, where you give a nod to Mary Douglas and the way that you did, and Susan Ackerman, and then I wonder, so much in our field is this bifurcation between people who do biblical theology and those of us who do thick stuff. Do you know? And I think the questions that those of us who are doing sort of material world are trying to get at are theological questions. They're just not within a language that is so embedded in what I think is an academic and even political structure of the Enlightenment, that they're heard in different ways. And you made the case study that you were mentioning, Professor Hansen, may not be one that draws you, but I think it would be so interesting to hear what other categories, what even other language you could use besides monotheism, so as though to begin to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm still looking for categories. So, yeah, I'm always open to hints and indications of where I might find such categories. Sometimes because I know the limitations of my own reading. And I think you're right. I mean, in some ways, the use of monotheism, I've kind of returned to it partly because it's the language used by a large part of our discipline. And so, therefore, in some ways, I'm trying to attempt a work of translation in some ways by still using this language, but then pulling into other things that the kind of concerns that you're raising. In which case, your question may be that I still need to think about how I do that and how that works. And I think, again, that would be fair.
Well, I think rather than thinking about how to do it, you're actually doing it in that one sort of thumbnail sketch you gave of the idols, the parallels you're drawing between, God versus the idol makers. And you reference them as say ritual and that kind of thing. And once again, people who are working on that, Kathy Becker and people in our comments, to see that not just sort of as a sort of, whatever most of the generation of Albright comparative methods kind of thing, but what does that dynamic between humans who enliven gods and gods who enliven humans mean about what God asked or what people understand the divine imperatives to be, and how that's supposed to structure covenantal life, and the exchange of power within it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there may be a way to pull together a couple of the comments through pushing on the category of rhetoric and linking that to some of these questions of practice. In part, what you're directing our attention towards is this idea that the text we're reading is preserving a persuasive project. And I think you're drawing attention to this sense that the speaker is trying to persuade the audience of certain things. You're framing the question as essentially, what are you trying to persuade them to do, and in what way are these particular images? Can we reconstruct how these might have been efficacious in the time, and what force they might have had that other images might not have had? So that might be a way to actually reframe the question away from monotheism, but into one. Is that productive?
Yes, I think it. Yeah, no, I think that would be, and it could be used to good effect in this paper to address the historical locatedness and also what I think are some of the elements that are there in Second Isaiah and are about the fact that he's trying to encourage. The language is encouraging the people to go back to Jerusalem.
So part of on the category of rhetoric, one move you could make is to say that focusing on rhetorical dimensions does not make any claim about whether you think either the speaker or the audience thought the claim was true. So it's redirecting our scholarly attention towards the role of these images in a persuasive project.
Yep.
That could, I think, start to encompass a lot of the things you're really trying to pull out of these courses as far as we go, while still preserving a sense of this as, in some sense, theology, the history of theology or the role of theology.
Yeah. And I can see that being linked in some ways to the whole question of speech act and what one's trying to do with language in Isaiah, and that would be to link it into another kind of discussion as well, but one that might richly inform how we're thinking about these texts. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'll take the chairman's privilege to ask one last question. I notice when you have this alleged victory that these people claim to find, the victory of monotheism, let's say late in the 6th century, it doesn't last very long. Because when you're in the Second Temple period, you suddenly find angels requiring names and functions, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, Uriel. By the time you get to, let's say, the Enoch literature, these people are all over the place. These angels are all over the place with names and distinct identities. You have the Satan, the Satan, breaking off and becoming an independent force. You have the notion of evil or whatever, the prosecutorial function as located in this Satan, whose relationship to the one God is a little unclear. And then you have the incipient Trinitarianism in Christianity. You have Metatron in Rabbinic Judaism, and ultimately you have, jump ahead 1,000 years, you have the Sphirot, the emanations of Kabbalah. So my question is part of the problem that they think of monotheism as a static, non-dramatic, non-dramatized, non-processual entity, as opposed to something that is somehow in a kind of, I don't want to call it dialectical, but some sort of tension with some other multiplicity of the divine world. In other words, the moment, if second Isaiah is monotheistic in their sense, that's a moment that disappears awfully fast. I wonder if you could reflect on that.
I think you're exactly right, and when I come back to this question, I realize that actually exactly that question is the one that has really been sitting in the back of my mind and has always puzzled me for over a decade, in that it does seem odd. And I think for all the examples you give, with my students, I like to draw their attention to this because of my own kind of context, this odd group who believe that Jesus has something to do with God. But all of those exist in the Second Temple period. I think I suppose the question might well be something along the lines of, even as I'm doing this, it draws attention to the fact that in this discussion, two main texts are important. And that's Deuteronomy and that's Second Isaiah. And some of the things that you're mentioning are already found in other texts that are placed under the rubric of monotheism, but not thought about or cared about too much, because they don't quite fit. So, the Satan in Job, Chronicles with the Satan, and as I've already pointed out, with the priestly literature. And I suppose the question for me, what is it about the limitation? What is it about the particularity of what is it about these particular texts that lends itself so readily to this, as you say, this kind of very fixed, non-processual view? I think with Second Isaiah, I'm beginning to think that it is because the message is more narrowly conceived, because it's just got a particular purpose, and so therefore certain things are just not included or not as clear as they might be in other texts. But I think that would be where I would be, as an introduction at this point.
Thank you very much.